By the summer of 414 BCE, the grand Athenian dream of conquering Sicily had degenerated into an exhausting, desperate siege around the city of Syracuse. The Athenian general Lysias had constructed a massive counterwall across the high cliffs of Epipolae, nearly sealing off the Syracuse landward approaches and driving the starving defenders to the brink of a diplomatic surrender. But the entire strategic dynamic flipped instantly when a single Spartan commander named Gylippus arrived on the coast of Sicily with a tiny relief force of Peloponnesian hoplites. Gylippus was a master of asymmetric land warfare, full of resourcefulness, energy, and an unyielding iron discipline that immediately breathed new life into the terrified Syracusan population. He marched his combined forces straight up the rugged passes of Epipolae, slipping past the unfinished gaps in the Athenian lines and entering the city gates amidst a roar of public celebration. Gylippus immediately halted the defensive retreat, organizing the citizens into construction crews to build a crosswall that ran perpendicular to the Athenian works. The two sides engaged in a furious, close-quarters masonry race across the high rocky plateau, hurling insults and spears at each other as they laid the heavy stone blocks in the dust. In a decisive infantry clash, Gylippus utilized the powerful Syracusan cavalry on the open flanks, shattering the Athenian wing and pushing the besiegers back into their trenches. The Syracusan crosswall surged past the Athenian lines, rendering Nicias' entire siege work useless in a single afternoon and trapping the Grand Armada against the swampy, malaria-ridden shores of the Great Harbor. The hunters had become the hunted. Nicias was forced onto the strategic defensive, sending a desperate, agonizing letter back to the Athenian assembly, begging for an immediate recall or a massive reinforcement fleet. In the winter of 413 BCE, the Athenian assembly gathered in the crowded theater to listen to the official letter sent from the front lines of Sicily. Nicias wrote with a brutal, clinical honesty, refusing to sugarcoat the catastrophic deterioration of their military capability. Our ships are leaking, our wood is rotting, and our crews are dissolving away through desertion. The letter stated plainly to the silent, stunned citizens. The enemy has learned our naval tactics, their numbers are expanding daily, and we no longer hold the advantage even on the water. I myself am crippled by a severe kidney disease and can no longer command. You must either recall us immediately or send out a second armada equal in size to the first. Instead of pulling back from the brink of the abyss, the Athenian democracy doubled down on its initial hubris with a terrifying political desperation. They refused to let Nicias resign, voting instead to dispatch a massive second armada under their finest remaining generals, Demosthenes and Eurymedon. The second fleet carried another 73 triremes and 5,000 elite hoplites, draining the final silver reserves of the empire, while Sparta was actively occupying a permanent fortress at Thessaly inside Attica itself. Demosthenes arrived in the great harbor of Syracuse with a spectacular blare of trumpets, hoping to shock the enemy into submission by a display of imperial power. He realized that time was their ultimate enemy, launching a reckless midnight assault up the sheer cliffs of Epipolae to recapture the crosswall. The night attack degenerated into a horrific, chaotic slaughter under the dim light of the moon. The Athenian troops grew confused, turning their weapons on their own allies as the whistling war chants of the Dorian forces triggered absolute panic in the dark. Over 2,000 Athenian soldiers fell over the precipice to their deaths or were cut down in the gullies, a crushing defeat that broke the spirit of the reinforcement force. Following the disaster on the cliffs, Demosthenes begged Nicias to pack up the camp immediately and retreat before the winter storms trapped them in the harbor. Nicias initially hesitated out of a profound fear of facing the wrath of the Athenian assembly at home. But as new Peloponnesian reinforcements poured into Syracuse, he finally relented, passing a secret order for the fleet to slip away at dawn. But on the exact night scheduled for the secret departure, the 27th of August, 413 BCE, a total eclipse of the moon struck the sky. The superstitious Athenian soldiers flew into a panic, viewing the darkening of the moon as a terrifying supernatural warning from the gods. Nicias, who was deeply prone to religious superstition, consulted the local soothsayers, who declared that the army must remain stationary for thrice 9 days, a full 27 days, before sailing. This religious delay proved to be the absolute death sentence for the entire Athenian empire. Discovering the Athenian plan to escape, Gylippus and the Syracusan navy launched a coordinated, aggressive assault to seal the great harbor completely. They moored a long line of merchant vessels, triremes, and heavy iron chains across the narrow mouth of the harbor, stretching from Plemmyrium to the city walls, creating a giant stone and floating cage. The final naval battle within the enclosed harbor was a scene of unparalleled, concentrated horror. Nearly 200 ships were locked in a claustrophobic deathmatch. There was no room for standard maneuvering or ramming tactics, turning the water into a chaotic platform for hand-to-hand combat. The Syracusans had reinforced the bows of their triremes with heavy timber beams, smashing directly into the fragile Athenian prows and shattering their hulls. The armies on the shoreline watched the shifting chaos with an agonizing intensity, screaming out in grief or joy as ships went down in bubbles of blood and foam. The Athenian fleet was utterly broken, losing 60 ships in the melee. The remaining crews refused to step back aboard, leaving the Grand Armada ruined and forcing a desperate retreat across the barren interior of Sicily. On the third day after the naval defeat, a starving mass of 40,000 Athenian refugees abandoned their camp, leaving their wounded and dying comrades behind on the sand. The unburied dead lay around them, while the dynamic wounded crawled after the marching lines, screaming out the names of their friends and clinging to their cloaks until their strength failed. Nicias and Demosthenes led the retreating columns through a gauntlet of absolute misery, marching under a relentless sun, while the Syracusan cavalry hovered on the ridges, hurling javelins and arrows down upon them. For 8 agonizing days, the Athenians found every river pass blocked, every well poisoned, and every hill guarded by an unyielding enemy force. The column under Demosthenes grew separated in the confusion, surrounded inside a walled olive grove where they were bombarded with missiles for hours until they surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. Nicias pushed his remaining starving column toward the Asinaris River, the soldiers maddened by an unquenchable, desperate thirst under the blistering heat. The moment they reached the banks, the discipline dissolved completely. The soldiers rushed headlong into the water, trampling one another underfoot and fighting to drink the muddy stream. The Peloponnesian forces stood on the steep ridges above, hurling heavy spears down into the packed mass of humanity below. The Syracusan cavalry charged directly into the riverbed, butchering the helpless men as they drank, the water turning thick, red, and polluted with blood and mud. Nicias surrendered unconditionally to Gylippus, falling to his knees and begging the Spartan commander to halt the slaughter of his remaining men. Nicias and Demosthenes were led away and executed against the stone walls of the city, their bodies thrown into unburied ditches. The 7,000 surviving prisoners were packed into the deep stone quarries of Acradina, trapped inside open, sheer rock pits under the burning sun by day and the freezing cold by night. For 70 days, they were fed a tiny ration of a half pint of water and a pint of grain, living alongside the decomposing bodies of their dead comrades until the air became a choking plague. Thucydides concludes Book 7 by noting that this was the most total ruin ever experienced by a Hellenic army. They were beaten at all points and in every way. Everything was monumental, and their destruction was absolute. Fleet, infantry, and everything else perished from the earth, leaving nothing but an empty echo of a grand imperial ambition that had crashed into the dark Sicilian abyss.